Let's see. Well, hello. Maybe you came here because I had a more salacious title, and so that's how you do titles. But I think back when I submitted that talk, or that title, I did a few practice runs of doing this presentation, and once I was presenting it in Washington, D.C. We can make jokes about that later. And the first question I got afterwards was very telling. It was this older person, as maybe Linda was alluding to earlier, and he said, "Have you ever actually been an enterprise architect?" And at that point, I realized I probably shouldn't talk about killing off people that I've never actually done the job of. So this is much more pleasant, rethinking enterprise architecture. Hopefully, it's even a little helpful. And you know what I find is. The reason I've been thinking about this a lot is in the area that I work in, most people would think of it as DevOps, but I just think of it as talking with larger organizations about how they improve their software. There's always developers and designers. There's the people who work on the product, and often your what people call leadership, or the higher level executives who have made those declarations that Linda was alluding to, that we're going to go do Agile, and they set the vision and the strategy. And I talk with them a lot, and they show up, but there's this role that I remember existing called enterprise architecture, and I don't think they show up very often. So they must be somewhere, and it seems like, as we'll get into, I think they did something useful for decades. Otherwise, they had a sweet job where they didn't have to do anything useful. But it seems like it's really odd that in thinking about how we're improving software, this role doesn't show up. So I don't have any definitive answers, as usual, but I want to go over kind of the state of affairs and like what I've seen larger organizations doing to not lose the benefits of enterprise architecture. See, now doesn't that sound better than assassins and ninjas? Hopefully that'll be more hopeful for you. So as mentioned, I don't know, I like to introduce myself because then I can control what it says and go on and on. So I work at Pivotal now, which is, we sell a fair amount of things, but essentially we have what you might think of as a platform as a service, just a big stack of runtime and development things that you use to run whatever sort of software you might have. And as I'll get into, what it is we aim for, and what I've been studying throughout most of my career is how organizations are improving the way they do software. And then also, a companion to that is how they're doing terrible things with software. You know, failure is failure in the negative sense, not in the failures learning sense, but death march types of failures are as instructive as successes are. So I like to study that quite a bit. Now, I've been an analyst at a couple of places like RedMonk and 451 Research, and I have a couple of podcasts that I do. I mean, I think the one people like the most is this software-defined talk one. Like, you know, it's your typical like weekly podcast with three white guys talking about things and relevant things in technology. So if you're into that format, it seems to be working out. I write a column here for the Register every now and then. Usually I make fun of how y'all spell virtualization in color, because the copy editors go through and do that, but I'll skip that for now and just point at it. And then I was a software developer, never an enterprise architect, for about 10 years before that. And oddly enough, I was walking around, and I worked at Dell. So I live in Austin, so you have to do a compulsory 2-year term working at Dell, at least if you live there. And I saw there's Quest software down there. And when I was at Dell doing strategy and M&A, that was like, you work on a lot. When you do M&A, you work on all sorts of acquisitions. Most of them you just take out behind the shed and shoot so that they don't sort of infect the rest of your organization. But that Quest one actually worked out. So that is always exciting to see them, or I should say, we transacted on it. And many years later, it became more of it went somewhere else. But it's always fun to see how they're doing. I think they're demoing Toad down there, which that's a delight. So my clicker thing doesn't work, which is fine. But so I wanted to just briefly connect to a little bit of what Linda was talking about. And I'm not really going to go over this in depth. There's a whole other line of conversation. But as we know now, there is no science in software. So that's good. But whatever the pseudoscience we're following is, I think what I see large organizations doing when they're doing software successfully, their own custom-written software, is they follow what I and some other people call a small batch process. And Linda actually went over it really well, right? It's you might call it like a casual application of the scientific method that's very low-key and not very scientific. But essentially, what I think we've learned from software over the short ages we've had is that we don't really know what we're doing. And we also don't really know what problems we're solving nor how to solve them. And I'll get into an example of that really quickly. But as she went over, you put this loop into place where you come up with a theory of how to solve the problem or whatever it is. And with software, you write code to run your experiment. And then it's also good to get it in front of real users. And as Linda emphasized, it's also handy to observe if it worked or not, something that I think historically we don't really do very much, except maybe through bug reports and software sales if you're a vendor. And then you go through that loop again and you keep refining until you find a way that solves the problem that you had in front of you. And what's remarkable and what DevOps helps out with and all the interesting containers and all this kind of stuff is organizations are getting this loop down to usually a week is sort of fair, but multiple times a day is the other end of the spectrum that they get to. So if you think about how many times with that fast feedback loop you can gather information and refine your software, you have this great engine to more rapidly improve the software that you have. And let me just give you a brief example of that, because I find it's good to have examples. I've been taught now to call them stories, not use cases, which is fine. So let me spin you a yarn. So back home, we have this branch of the government called the IRS. As my grandfather used to call it, the Internal Revenue Service. And every year, they collect taxes, because we like to have highways and things like that. We're not quite like crazy libertarians. And what happens is sometimes, for whatever reason, people don't pay their taxes on time, and you get penalized. And the way they do that, they've got this great notification system where every day you owe more money. So you're highly motivated to call them up, figure out how much you owe in taxes, and pay it off that day. Now, previously, they ran this through call centers, and you would have to call someone up. And then to say it in IT terminology, they had a uptime or availability of about 37%, which meant, if I can do math on the fly, what is that, 63%? 63% of the time, they would just hang up on you. Which they would call a courtesy disconnect. Because really, who wants to talk to the IRS? It's sort of like a hidden user story. You can get along with your day and try again later maybe, and have some pleasantries with that money you save by not paying your taxes. So, of course, what they thought is like, that's terrible service. Our budgets are reduced all the time because we do terrible service. And also, we would like to collect that money. So someone had the good idea that software solves this problem. So they kicked off a small batch process, or a way of experimenting with how to solve that problem. And their first theory was, when you log into the application, they're accountants, financial-oriented accounting people. And like a lot of technologists, right? Like when you build some way of looking at your logs or your metrics, like there's a certain thrill in like seeing all of it and correlated together on like a black screen with neon text. Like you can probably go down to the App Dynamics booth and just see everything that you could collect. So when you're an accountant type, what you think is, well, surely people would like to see their entire relationship with the IRS and relive all the wonderful moments that we had together. And so what you get is this screen here on the before. And I've highlighted in orange what you're supposed to see. But because they were working in a small batch thing and put it in front of users and paid attention to the result of the experiment, what they found is when they presented this, when they recreated the Facebook moments or whatever they do in iOS land, people were confused, they didn't know how much they owed, and they wanted to pick up the phone. So immediately, if you think about this from a success or even a business standpoint, they're a total failure, right? They've ruined their whole goals, their metrics, everything is trashed. But because they were doing experiments, casual or otherwise, they were able to come up with a new way of doing it and test it out again. And over the course of, I don't actually know the time period, several weeks, they found out that by testing this out, that when you want to know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS. You indeed don't want to relive your moments with the IRS, as fun as that sounds. So they were able to put this into place, and they followed this process of doing it weekly, running on top of, you would probably be wise to think, pretty agile and DevOpsy infrastructure. And as of like October of last year, they've brought in almost $500 million of taxes, of back taxes, and there's been over 2 million users. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at that, I think like, whoa, we got to like send these people back to civics classes, because 2 million's a lot of people who don't pay their taxes on time. But I guess that's a whole other problem that we might have. Now, encouragingly, you see results like this from, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but in an instructive way, lots of boring companies. So there, this is a selection of everyone's favorite insurance companies and many people's not favorite, the US Air Force. And all of these companies traditionally have been very slow, taking years and years to get software in place. And they end up with that result that I was going over with the IRS, that software that's often over schedule, that might be over budget, but more importantly, doesn't really work as well as it should, right? And a lot of what we learn from and gain with DevOps is this sort of, as Gene Kim says up there, what I really like on the I guess that would be your right side of the column, well, actually the middle column, is you have these, what we would call in the business, business outcomes, or you have these things that occur, right? Like, it's great to be able to deploy your servers in like 30 seconds and do all this, like, all your stateless stuff and your immutable infrastructure. But, I was talking with an enterprise architect here yesterday. Like, if you don't actually, like, it sounds ridiculous, but if you don't, like, change the screen that end users are using, like, who cares? Like, it doesn't cause anything to happen that changes the experience of your users, that improves the way that your business is running. And so, I think those examples are great, and I search for them all the time because, again, I also get the objection that, like, oh, that sounds great if you're one of these startups with $300 million and you lose $500 million every year, and you don't actually have to be profitable or work on any constraints, and you basically write 3 applications, and you can bring your dogs to work, and you get free breakfast, and you can wear an Iron Man t-shirt and open-toed shoes. Like, of course you can do software that way. But indeed, there are many organizations where you can't wear open-toed shoes, or I think that means flip-flops you're not supposed to wear, or thongs, as some people would call them. But yeah, if you wear fancy shoes, you can do it too. So I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this is sort of like the best representation of what has been studied in DevOps. And I have a degree in philosophy, so I'm just taking it on, we don't have science in there for a long time, based on the work that the sort of like more scientific-minded people have done there. And there, I don't know, there's some cluster analysis or something. I don't know, it seems convincing. It's a lot more than convincing than some sort of solipsism thing that I used to read about. Anyhow, so this is a great report that you can go look up, and there's larger books. But the point is that you put in place highly automated infrastructure. You put in place a continuous build pipeline. You're basically, as SRE people would talk about, automating a tremendous amount of the effort that is manual. And then you also have what people will call culture, which is an exciting nebulous term that sounds really great. But I think more of culture as like the processes that you follow, the policy that you have, and also things like, whenever you talk about culture. We can that afterwards in our retrospective. How was the incident resolved? We can hopefully it's a blameless postmortem that we do, because the problem is if you blame people when there's an incident, they go kill the PA system, and you never know when an incident happens again. So remember, when we talk about this later, don't blame anyone. Don't say who did the problem. Say how did the system allow this problem to occur, and how might we fix it? So anyhow, there's a whole lot of process and cultural things that come along, which mostly resolve around being nice to people, understanding them, figuring out a process that actually works well. And as I like to flippantly summarize it, don't do dumb stuff, right? That's a lot of what process stuff works out well for. Anyways, if you remember this scene, it's a lot like what occurs when organizations, they see those astounding results of we've done great, we're an exciting insurance company, and we've entered a new market, and we're following all this fun Agile DevOps-y stuff, and we've doubled our average sales. Hey, we're making money. You can go buy yourself a fancy new Apple laptop on the company. That's kind of what it trickles down to for us, right? Or you finally get a new foosball table after 10 years. Anyhow, what often occurs is, you're sitting there playing your foosball or whatever you may do, sort of playing your video games, and you've heard that you're going to be doing digital transformation. And kind of just like this scene, you're having a good time. Maybe you're playing around with Captain Picard or something. And then it's usually like this older person. It's typically the person who comes. It's very typical that they're bald, that they don't have much hair. And they've got kind of like a funny disposition, and they come in and they say like, I'm the digital consultant, digital transformation consultant. Wonderful things are going to happen. You're going to become agile. You're going to become a great company. There's a few little steps you're going to need to go through, no problem. And the next thing you know, you've got your hand in this metaphoric box, and you're like, oh, by the way, like how does this usually go? And then your new friend is like, oh, most everyone dies when they do this. So good luck with that. I'm going to be on to my next gig after that. So this is really the state that most organizations are in, is they, to use a purposeful word, they have this imperative to do digital transformation. And I think for enterprise architects, that causes no end of consternation, right? Like, one, they're often charged with, I've been in many meetings like this where I used to meet a lot of enterprise architects, I guess, or maybe three I've met in the past 3 years. And I remember one of the meetings that I had was particularly emblematic of the strange bald person with a needle on her hand coming there. And I was sitting there, and the enterprise architect said, we got to come up with the cloud strategy for our big airline. They said, and he held up this piece of maybe like a 30-page document, and he said, now, does this seem like a good cloud strategy to you? And of course, being mildly educated, I said, well, can I read it? And he said, no, you can't read it. So that was an odd situation. But you have a lot of these situations where people have to come up with the cloud strategy. And as software people, your first question would be not only to read the document, but like, well, what do you want? What are your requirements? And usually by the time you've asked that question, whoever told you need to do a cloud strategy has long since left. Maybe they've been to the annual sales retreat or something, but you're often told you need to digitally transform. So there's a whole lot of issues that come up with that, and I think Linda nicely hit on a few of them, a lot of change management that needs to go on. But one of the things that occurs is you introduce a lot of the notions of DevOps and other things like that, which create problems for enterprise architects. Now, the first problem, to kind of start at the end, to what was the Covian tip, imagine the end before the beginning, or something like that. But at this end state, and this is from a US health insurance company, that you get to this end state where you're doing 8 or 15 releases a week, and you were supposed to go to the change advisory board or like talk to the enterprise architect about your TOGAF 9.1 reference architecture update. But you can't really do that multiple times a day. Like, I don't know if you've ever tried to schedule a successful senior person at a company, but like it takes weeks. And then often they cancel because they don't want to go, or they have an actual high priority thing to do, or there's some sort of emergency in the conference room that they're at or whatever. But you can't really engage with a traditional enterprise architecture process if you're delivering even weekly, let alone multiple times a week. And this comes up over and over again. And so what you want to find out as an enterprise architect is either get a really strong union so that you don't become unemployed, which works out a lot better on this side of the Atlantic. Like if you go down to France and you give this talk, they're like, no, our problem is not that we need to preserve our jobs. It's that these people can't be fired. So we need to figure out how to manage that. Anyhow, so what is the enterprise architect to do? Well, I think the first thing to understand is that it is great to deploy 8 to 10 times a week or daily or whatever. And of course, these deploys, as Linda was talking about, are very small changes, right? You don't deploy a year's worth of work in a week. You figure out how to chop down the scope of what you're doing so it's a small little change that you're doing. Now, I was joking about those startup companies that just lose money, which I should be careful about now that everyone knows the financials of our company, making fun of. Anyways, but this is from Comcast, the big, gigantic telco cable provider. I don't think they operate over here. You might know NBC, which they own. But this is one of their core systems, the enterprise architecture at a high level of the core system. And this is the system they use basically to manage, I think it's the TV, I forget, but manage their customers. And it has everything soup to nuts, as they say. That's a fun phrase to look up the etymology of if you're into that kind of thing. But it has dealing with customers signing up, dealing with the ongoing billing. It has a voice system and an online system for dealing with problems that they have. It manages sending technicians out to the field. So it's basically everything to support their cable business. Now, in theory, if you have this, there's a minimal amount of enterprise architecture that you need, right? Like, it's one application, you might have 50 or 100 people working on it. You can kind of wrap your head around it. But the issue that Comcast has is, they not only have that application, they have many other applications of equal complexity. And like, this is actually kind of a mid-sized company. What you actually see is most companies are like this, maybe times 5, right? So someone like a JP Morgan Chase, they have about 19,000, maybe 20,000 developers, right? And let's just sort of like back of the napkin it. And let's say that many developers probably support 500 to 2,000 applications that are in various stages of their ownness, or silos, as DevOps people would say. So clearly, if you're into efficiencies and things working well, you're going to need some kind of oversight. And your independent DevOps teams are probably not going to be the best people to make sure all of this stuff fits together well. And that, to use an old enterprise architecture term, that you don't have duplication across these things. Now, there's all sorts of efficiencies to be argued for, but there is also time savings that enable doing better things if you have shared resources and services that ultimately fulfill what I think is kind of the goal of enterprise architects, which is like, we want to make sure that IT actually helps the business side out, whether you're a profit business or you're a nonprofit-oriented business. Like, the computers should be helpful. And a lot of what enterprise architects end up doing nowadays focuses on that. But when you have that many applications, right, you can't just apply this, back in my day, we would call it cowboy coders, right? Like, people would talk about Agile and XP, and they would be like, that sounds like madness, a bunch of cowboys. But you can't really just kind of maraud through all of those applications. You need some sort of adult responsibility. And developers get really bored with ruling and governing, so they have to get promoted to be enterprise architects. So there's a great history in this book, Introduction to Enterprise Architecture, of sort of like the arc of enterprise architecture, from mainframes and other things like that. And for time's sake, since we wanted to all be safe, I'll skip over this. But it's fun to kind of think about how different phases of enterprise architecture came about, like integrating mainframes that were siloed and getting a focus on the data, making sure that you have this mythical business IT alignment, and then all this kind of governance stuff that comes up. And then, of course, there's always the rational unified process, something that I read up a lot on, and it was fun. I actually saw that. I was at a bank in Bangkok, and there was just this sad RUP poster hanging out in the corner of the conference room. It was a good old friend there. So you've got all these methodologies which are very precise and thorough and end up kind of being cumbersome with the way that you want to operate. And there's a good kind of funny way of putting it, is like all of those things seemed good at the time. They made sense. We should have some governance over this so that, I don't know, we should probably, instead of having 30 single sign-on services, maybe we should have 4, right? Like, we should consolidate these things down, and also we've got to address security. But what you end up over a time is you end up going from speedboats that are very agile and move around to these paddle boats that are very slow and big. They transport a lot of people, they move things around. But what I always think is, I don't know if you've ever been on a booze cruise. Sounds great at first, right? We're going to get a bunch of free alcohol, hang out with people that I kind of sort of can tolerate from work, but the alcohol will help. And then you're on there, and if you're like me, you've had 3 drinks, and you look at your watch, and you're like, holy crap, there's 3 more hours of this, and I can't leave because I'm on a boat. And like, that's a lot of what governance ends up being for people, is they're stuck on this thing that was effective and worked well, and they can't really moderately drink very effectively. So how are enterprise architects getting over this? So to reframe the problem, right? Like, we're introducing an Agile and a DevOps way of doing things. We're able to run this kind of small batch experimentation, and maybe we don't know what our science around it, but we're sort of steadily doing like the IRS was and discovering that we can create better software. So how are the enterprise architects, how are they going to help out, and how could they actually address some of those problems of complexity that are there? So first of all, what I've noticed is the orientation of what an enterprise architect does. I don't quite know yet if it's a subset of what they used to do, but it sort of reduces down or simplifies, if you will. And these are every now and then I like to use some smart art, so I've done that here. But I think what they end up focusing on are 3 things, right, which I've put in a very simple thing. So one, they focus on the process that the organization is going to use, or what I would call like the meatware, right, not the software or the hardware, but how all the people work together in the organization. And 2, they're responsible for making sure you have a pipeline, which is it sounds ridiculously simple, but it's not only continuous integration, but you also have continuous delivery and all of the automation and changes to process that come from that, right? And this is more than just like automating your build. It's theoretically, you could do what people would call push button deploys, where a developer could change the little bit of code and then it could be in production in a matter of minutes, right? Now, no one actually does that because that's just a little too much for most people to handle. Or I should say, regular organizations don't do that. But getting to the point where you could do that affords you all sorts of benefits and is definitely something that most folks don't do. And then they tend to establish a standardized, centralized platform that defines not only the infrastructure, but also the middleware and the shared services, the way that all of those different teams package up, deploy, and then the way that they also manage that software, right? So instead of having 30, 50, 500, 1,000 different ways of doing that, different types of custom infrastructure, you don't really get to decide what the infrastructure is. The decisions are made about how you'll manage it. So if you start thinking about it, there's a lot of governance that gets automated. So one of the primary things that enterprise architects still do, I think, is give a huge amount of input on what most people would call strategy. And that is, what is it that my organization wants to do? And how do I figure out providing the IT capabilities to provide that? Now, it's very nuanced here, right? They're not saying, given the IT capabilities that we have, how can we help the business? Instead, they're saying, what do they need to actually complete their job, right? Now, I like this picture because this is, everyone's all into like lean stuff, whether it's uppercase or lowercase. And this is one of the original Toyota looms that they had, right? So lean, of course, comes from Toyota originally, and they made looms, and then they made cars, and they still make cars. I think I might have skipped over something there. But I always wonder when I read this history, like, that's great that they learned that you've got your Kaizen and your crazy shut down the line cord and you do all this kind of stuff, but like, who decided to make a loom? Like, how did that come about? And I haven't really tracked that down yet. And you can equally ask, like, why did they decide to go from looms to cars? And so far, I'm pretty sure it's because one of the sons of the original Toyota was like, cars are awesome. We should make cars. And so you do need some input from a technical perspective of like, can we actually move from looms to cars? Like, how would we be using this IT to enable what your business ends are? And I think there's all sorts of methodologies you can follow, and a tremendous amount of enterprise architecture lore and folklore and science is based around this idea of, the phrase I always grew up with is mapping the business to IT. Always lots of mapping and connecting. And I think what's different and interesting here, right, is that a lot of where the cutoff point for enterprise architects are nowadays is somewhere in the middle of here, right? They used to spread all the way down into doing requirements and specifying technologies, but a lot of that is taken care of by the pipeline and the platform that they have, the kind of DevOps-y infrastructure. And then a lot of that responsibility of deciding what to do, observing what those small batches are, driving the sort of mapping of the IT to the business is driven by the individual teams that are doing it, instead of kind of coming down on high from an enterprise architect or a business analyst or whatever people who are certified with like PPM certifications do in the world. Something else I haven't done, so I shouldn't make fun of. But sort of illustrating that, one of the things that affects how enterprise architects' role changes, but also is an opportunity for how they can help their organization, is typically, I don't think there's actually 3-ring binders anymore of requirements and specifications. I think often, what they end up being is like an excuse to figure out how like OneDrive works, because your email attachment won't fit that Word document you have, so you've got to like figure out your SharePoint or OneDrive so you can send a link to it, which, I mean, I don't know about you, but that'll like kill your afternoon, and then it's lunchtime, and who really works in the afternoon? So that's a good way, one, to kill a day's worth of activity. But what you instead see is that organizations are shifting over from those 3-ring binders and giant attachments to, as Linda was kind of talking about, maybe not on like a cycle-by-cycle thing, but they're a lot more flexible about what their requirements are going to be a year from now or 2 years from now. And they realize that as they're deploying their software more, they're going to be adjusting what those requirements are and what would be in the binder. And it also has all sorts of exciting if you're into this kind of thing, knock-on effects of actually improving your risk management, giving you more control over the budget that you have, and also, I mean, the wonderful effect of like your software doesn't suck as much if you follow more of a small batch process. So that's one of the first things that enterprise architects have a huge role in affecting is we're not really going to have these 3-ring binders. And instead, I'm going to help out the teams learn how to think in this new way of, there's always a lot of Post-it notes. So like, the enterprise architect's going to expense a bunch of Post-it notes and sort of like teach them how to think on more of a weekly or a monthly basis and kind of make sure, there's still like this impossible task of like, we should make sure if we're doing like maybe an online bill pay system, probably a year from now, we're still going to want to be taking money from an account and sending to someone else, right? So you need to have this overarching vision of what's happening, but you break down how you do it. Now, another important thing is that the enterprise architect can do in a leadership position is it's very often the case that in these organizations, they've been agile for a long time. You've probably got, I often hear how many Scrum Masters people have, and that sounds wonderful. Good job on the Scrum Mastering. But what you find and what this survey kind of shows, and just very briefly, like if you read the blue, that tells you in this survey how many of these practices were done. And the green, of course, is planning to do, which I always think of as not ever going to do. So I just plan, I look at the blue, and you see that in aggregate, most organizations are actually not following most agile practices. So part of what leadership, and I think the EA is very well positioned to do this, is it's probably a good idea to go down to these teams and make sure they're actually doing software in a good way. In the best practices that we've built up over the past 25 years or so. And again, that's a form of governance that you would expect the EAs to do. But what I find is that instead of it being that, like we're gonna govern you with this giant document of governance, they have more success when they do it through events and meetings, internal conferences, and actually working alongside these teams to educate them and train them how they're doing these things. So I'll be brief here. There's also a bunch of legacy software. I don't know, someone's got to worry about that. Like, you got all your fancy DevOps stuff, and then there's the whole rest of the, the IT department that runs all the old stuff that makes all the money. And someone's got to contend with that. And I always like to imagine that there's one of those scary, like, Japanese ghost children with black hair back there. So, you don't want to deal with that if you're doing DevOps. Send someone else. So equally, and pardon me for rushing through all of this, so there's another thing that I think we assume in the DevOps cloud native world. Like if you've ever read up on microservices, like I don't know if you've heard the good word, but man, it's going to solve all your problems. Like I don't know if you remember the SOA and the WS star, that was a disaster, clearly. Like clearly if we have some sort of easily human readable format that specifies how data is going to be sent, and it's a networked application with endpoints that you can very agilely and dynamically compose together and work on independently for a service, that's a bad idea, which, that's basically your service-oriented architecture. Now, instead what you need is you need that times 300, and that's going to solve your problems. I mean, I make fun of microservices. Done well, they actually are very effective and directly help the business out by being able to innovate more. But again, you should probably have someone manage that, right? And these are the spaghetti bowls when microservices were first coming out from our fun, money-losing companies. But you do see a need for, someone's got to specify which services there are. You probably want to deduplicate things that you have across there. So there is a big need for that big picture sort of tops-down view. Or nowadays, you're not supposed to speak hierarchically. Let's say like side-in view or something. Maybe there's a fourth dimension of governance that has no sort of judgment or bias built into it. Everyone's fine with the fourth dimension of direction. So someone needs to look into that and make sure that you're managing it. You don't want to just leave that up for other people. So then finally, wrapping up here, I mentioned that there's often a platform in place that people do. And looking at the agenda, there's a lot of talks here about building this platform or getting this platform or putting it in place. And if you think about it, so if you're in 2009, let's say, and you were like, this cloud thing is pretty awesome, and we're just going to run everything on AWS. If you think of Amazon as a platform, right? And nowadays, all the great public clouds are like this, and my company is happy to sell you something that you would run on top of that or your own infrastructure to achieve these wonderful dreams. You should definitely try my product. It's fantastic. But what you have is you've got all of the integrated, not only middleware, like databases and queues and pagination frameworks, but you also have the other required things you need, like your build pipeline, right? Like your version control is intimately tied into this. You always have whatever it is. I never understood, despite working at BMC, I never really knew what these infrastructure people did except hide behind help desks and say no all the time. But then also, like, it's handy once you have the software to run it in production. I find that's valuable for success with software. So you also want to account for how you would manage it and make sure that your applications are manageable, which is kind of the origin of DevOps, right? Like, if you remember, or if you've read on the history of DevOps, it was like these developers, they keep writing software that does not run in production, which is sort of a problem. So maybe the developers should not do that, right? Which goes back to my base law of, like, don't do dumb stuff. So what that means is that developers need to be much more aware of how, as we would say, day two operations, how things are operated in production, which is also built into your platform. So what I see over and over again is, rather than having each individual team or division or whatever build their own infrastructure, integrate together their own middleware, integrate it with whatever operational support they have, deal with whatever it is networking people do, like do all of this stuff instead, someone in a very enterprise architect kind of role compresses that down into a platform. And indeed, a lot of the people that I talk with who are enterprise architects, they are the ones who have specified, built, and now run this platform. And it's funny talking with these types of people. Like, there's some people at Allstate, one of the insurance companies I referred to, and I was interviewing them on one of my podcasts. And after a while, I said, like, oh, you're basically enterprise architects. And they were like, look, can you edit that out? Because if anyone calls us that back at work, they will not like us. You can't say that we're enterprise architects. So this happens very frequently, that people in these roles actually are doing a lot of enterprise architecture, and they're just sort of hiding from, for whatever reason, the sort of stigma associated with that. And then finally, as you can imagine, this gets to a very DevOpsian sort of concept, which is, if you are the enterprise architecture, or the enterprise architect, and you've made up all of this governance of how you're going to be doing things, and you've specified what the runtime needs to be like, and how all the boxes and lines hook up with each other, like, sort of like with the developer, it would be cool if when your enterprise architecture got into production, it actually worked, right? Which I think is, again, nice to have. And I think that one of the ways DevOps solves this, sometimes jokingly, but also sometimes very seriously, is like, well, if you specify the governance, you're in charge of running it, right? Which is where a platform comes into play, because you actually have implemented this governance. And then, as I was alluding to, you can actually, as an enterprise architect, and this might be where it's good to find another job if you're not into actually running software, you actually end up being on the team in kind of a product manager role that is responsible for that platform running. And you have this very, to be all highfalutin, like physical, I guess actually it's not very physical, but you've got this embodiment of your governance. And in that cycle, in treating governance like a product, right? You're treating all the product teams like your customers or your users. You're continually running your own small batch ideas to see what's effective and how you should change your enterprise architecture around. And then also you have to suffer through learning how to best run it and what would work. I think you get as good an enterprise architecture as you would the software products that I was talking about earlier, which again is like the idea of enterprise architects actually running technology is pretty foreign nowadays, and it might be a little crazy, but again, that's what I tend to see organizations in this role doing that is quite successful. So finally, I'll just give a short reading thing. So this guy, Mark Schwartz, he used to be the CIO of one of the immigration departments at the US. He was the CIO of the immigration department that welcomes people, not the ones that like kicks their ass out of the country. So he's a pretty nice guy. And he's got a couple of books that are great. In particular, this one has a lot of cogitating on enterprise architecture. And I think he raises a really good point that's good to think about. It is that you shouldn't look at enterprise architects and enterprise architecture as like onerous. And instead, what you're doing is they are in charge of building up this corporate asset that is basically your capability to do software well, right? And in the same way that you would manage any other corporate asset, that isn't IT related. You put that amount of feed and caring and mindfulness into it, which I don't think we've necessarily, we've done at certain points over the years, but we don't really do that, at least the people I talk with large organizations. They don't get that from the rest of the organization, that IT is very important and is a core capability that we have and an asset that we groom and take care of. So also, there's a whole lot of stuff I didn't talk about, a tremendous amount, and there's this PDF that you can get. You got to like lead gen yourself, but you can put a plus sign after your Gmail address, and then that works too. So you can just totally avoid lead genning. But this goes over a lot of the front matter that I didn't actually cover, like what that small batch thing is and why organizations are doing it, if you want to familiarize yourself with that. And with that, thanks for having me. I enjoyed visiting the lawn with you. That was refreshing. It was nice to get outside. I always think, maybe one day I should pick up smoking, because it's like something I could have done then. Because you can't really like pull out your phone and like check your social media, because then you're an asshole, right? But like you're not paying attention to people. But if you're smoking, that'd be great. Give me something to do. Anyways, I always like to end with this, because I think it's a lot of what I've ended up focusing over the years on, and definitely what Pivotal focuses on and the team that I work on, is not only figuring out how to do software better, but also telling people. And that's really like what, other than checking out and then buying my fantastic product that helps me pay the bills. You should totally do that. What I really like to implore people to do is, like, as an IT community, we haven't been that great over the years about talking to each other and telling each other how things operate, which is why we get all these examples of like how Spotify does it, and isn't Facebook and Google wonderful in how they do things. And I think those are great to an extent, but it'd be better to learn like how these gigantic government agencies do things, or this bank, or this manufacturing company. And we're just now in this period where organizations actually talk with each other. So you should figure that out. You can go to like a meetup, or I don't know, make a podcast, or go to a fancier conference, whatever the case may be. When you learn things that work and don't work, you should tell people. So yeah, thanks for having me, and I'll be around more or less, and I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. I don't actually answer the phone like most civilized people, but there's many other ways that you can reach me, and I am always interested in hearing things, because if you can't tell, basically what I do is just steal content of other people and make 10-point font attributing it to them and pretend like I came up with the idea. So I always need new material. So enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.